Hi, and welcome to Entourage.com. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Ben Krueger of Authority Engine. Uh, welcome, Ben, and thanks for being on the show with us.
Thanks. Excited to be here and just pumped to talk some podcasting chops.
Yeah, so, Authority Engine is known for results-driven podcasting, which we're going to get to in a moment, and talk a little bit about how people can themselves podcast and be successful at podcasting. But before we do that, can you share a little bit about how you even got into the podcasting business?
Absolutely. So I was kind of looking for a business opportunity. This is a couple months back, a little bit, about 7 months back, and I had been really avid into podcasting, listening to podcasts. That's kind of what kept me going through my 9 to 5, four white walls style job that I had at the time. And so podcasts and listening to podcasts about, entrepreneurship and lifestyle business and that kind of stuff is what really kept me going. And so when I started to get into podcasting, I checked out the Lifestyle Business Podcast, or what was then the Lifestyle Business Podcast by Dan Andrews and Ian Schoen. And I was really interested in kind of checking it out, learning kind of how it worked. So I started doing a bunch of research on how the whole thing worked, because I saw a lot of requests bouncing around in different forums and different online stuff. People were looking for podcast editors. So the going way to do it at that point was to hire a VA and train them up on how to edit your podcast and that kind of thing, which is great, but it really didn't add any value to the show. It just kind of kept things going along for them. So I contacted Dan directly and essentially offered to do the LBP for them, as far as like all the back end stuff. So essentially they do the recordings and then they send the recordings to me, and I would publish it, write up the show notes, all that kind of stuff, link out to stuff in the show notes. And at first he said no. At first he's like, nope, not interested, don't want it. And so I kind of revamped what it was I was offering him, and had kind of a sit-down chat with what it was that interested him about the services and what he didn't like about it, kind of repackaged it, and then started doing the podcast for the LBP, and kind of things have grown from there. I've been doing the Authority Engine podcast, so I've gotten an opportunity to interview all kinds of really interesting, really successful podcasters that are doing some really cool stuff with their shows. And so I've been learning a lot through launching podcasts for clients and managing podcasts for clients, as well as interviewing some of these guys that are doing some really cool stuff.
So you not only help people podcast, but you also podcast yourself ultimately. So it's kind of a mixture. You're not only teaching others how to do it, but you're doing it too.
Yeah, and the podcast it's a little bit meta. It's focused on how to use your podcast to better market your business. So we definitely focus on people who podcast to further their image online and to as a marketing leg for their business, as opposed to just like comedy podcasts or story podcasts, that kind of thing.
Which podcasts have you seen to be the most popular? Is there a particular genre or type that seems to, no matter what happens, seems to keep going up?
There's so many interview entrepreneur podcasts out there right now, which there's a couple that are popping up that are doing something interesting, that are doing something different, which is where it really needs to be. But the entire business, marketing, and entrepreneur space is just blowing up with podcasts right now.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about, since we're talking about business and entrepreneurship and startups, there's probably a lot of people that are going to want to know, how can I successfully launch a podcast? What are the 3 rules that I should keep in mind when launching a podcast or wanting to get into the podcast business?
So when you're getting into podcasting, typically it comes down to the very basics. A lot of people kind of skip those first steps. And this kind of goes back to any business. If you're starting a blog, if you're doing content of any kind, you absolutely want to start with your listener. Who is it that you're trying to target? And I like to get clients to think 2 years in advance. So if you are working let's say you've got an e-commerce store, you got a blog, or you've got something going on, think, all right, where do I want this business to be in 2 years, and who is the target client in 2 years? Because blogging, podcasting, just like blogging or video or any other type of content, it can take a little bit of time to build up some steam and really build that clout with your name or your brand or whatever it is you're trying to promote. So I like to help clients look 2 years out and then really nail down and clearly define who it is your target listener is. And why, number 2, is why should they be listening to you? There's all this content out there. There's a lot of really great bloggers and other podcasters and forums and all that kind of stuff out there. Why should they come to you instead of these other information sources? So what do you have that specifically offers them more value than anywhere else? And then the third part of that is kind of bringing in what results you want to achieve from the show. So you always have to start with your end objectives as well as your target audience, what they want from you, so you can mix those and come together with something that's going to be really valuable for your audience as well as get you whatever it is you're looking to do. So the most common goals that I hear are gain authority in my niche, gain some popularity, grow my audience naturally, and get exposure to a new audience, which is a huge one. And then, it comes down to a couple more specific goals like grow my email list, that kind of thing. So we really try to focus and bring the focus back to, number 1, who's your listener? Number 2, why should they listen to you and what value do you offer them? And number 3, what do you want to get out of the podcast instead of just pushing out content every week?
So I heard something great that I want to kind of take a second to talk about. You said having a great value proposition is really ultimately what differentiates a podcast from the millions out there. So can you speak a little bit about what it takes to create a good value proposition? I mean, it seems like we've seen everything these days. There's already like every type of business opportunity, every type of new podcaster comes out that has something to share about why they're a better guru than the next one. So ultimately, how does someone create, or what goes into creating a good value proposition?
That's a really good question. So the value proposition comes typically from 2 different ways. And podcasting in general comes down to entertainment and information. Kind of a combination of those 2 factors. And a lot of people forget that podcasting has to be entertaining because otherwise, people have so many other sources they can get their information. They don't have to listen to you. So, but it comes down to, so it's got to be somewhat entertaining, at the very least, and then it's got to be informative. So what kind of information is your audience looking for? So for Authority Engine, for my podcast, for example, the people that listen to my podcast want to figure out, how do I produce a show that gets me more results for my business? So whether that's engaging with my audience better, whether that's getting people to go back to my website to sign up to my email list, whether that's developing more of a community feel between my audience and me and between my audience members. So what I've done with that podcast is I've focused it on very actionable episodes that where I interview other podcasters that are doing a really good job with their show for a very specific item. So let's say one episode I interviewed Daniel J. Lewis, and I interviewed him about his iTunes page and how it's specifically set up so that listeners, so that it's easy to use for listeners and it's easy to get found in iTunes. So a listener to my show can go away and with a very step-by-step, formulaic, actionable